Trigger warning. This podcast episode contains discussions of emotional abuse. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Serene Leeds, and I'm so glad you're here. You guys, are you listening? This podcast recently reached a huge milestone. Are you ready? 1,000 downloads. I know I've said this before, but I'm just blown away by this news. Yes, it's still small potatoes by most podcasting standards, but I never thought my little show would reach that kind of an audience. So, as always, I have you, my small but mighty audience, to thank for this achievement. And of course, the brave souls who have already come forward and shared their stories with me. It's cliche, but this podcast would be nothing without you. I'm so excited to share today's episode with you. But as always, Emotional Abuse is Real still needs your support, and there are several ways you can do that. First of all, if you're a listener and you've been mulling over sharing your story, please don't hesitate to reach out via Instagram at Serene Leeds Writes. That's SarenLeedsWrites, or via email. My email address is hello@sereneleeds.com. That's SarenLeeds. A reminder that anonymous guests are always welcome. Also, if you are a mental health professional who would like to offer your clinical insights, I would love to feature you on this podcast as well. Another way you can support Emotional Abuse is Real is by heading over to Apple Podcasts and both leaving a rating and writing a review. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for people to find this podcast. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, you can support the podcast by donating to our Buy Me a Coffee page, which I've linked in the show notes. As I've said before, this is a one-woman operation, and your donations help fund the podcast's production costs. On today's episode, I'll be chatting with Carrie Mead, a licensed psychotherapist, life coach, and Reiki healer. If you're a regular listener, then you know I'm quick to say that I am not a mental health professional, and that I always recommend that people who have experienced emotional abuse seek out licensed therapists, and to not use this podcast as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. Carrie, on the other hand, is a mental health professional, so I'm thrilled that she agreed to come on the podcast to discuss her clinical insights on emotional abuse. My final reminder before we get into the episode is, please know that I understand the content on this podcast may be difficult for many of you. I've spoken to several people who want to listen to this podcast and who do want to share their stories, but they just don't feel ready to do either yet. I'm here to tell you that I completely understand your decision. As I've done on previous episodes, I am more than happy to narrate your story if you don't feel comfortable appearing on the podcast. Also, please know that it's taken me nearly a decade after my own emotional abuse experience to be able to talk about it so openly. I'm always happy to chat with you over Instagram, DM, or via email. I'm at Serene Leeds Writes on Instagram and hello@sereneleeds.com if you want to shoot me an email. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Carrie. Hi, Carrie. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. If we could start just by you introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me. First of all, my name's Carrie Mead, and I am a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Maryland. And I'm also a certified life coach and a Reiki practitioner.
Excellent.
Lots of holistic healing in different ways.
That's great. Yeah, I'm a fan of Reiki. So when partnered with professional mental health therapy, so that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
So So I guess we'll just start because up until now, the podcast has mainly been survivors telling their stories. So I'd love to hear from you from a clinical perspective. What is emotional abuse?
Yeah, so emotional abuse is really this nebulous gray term that we hear, and it's like very popularized right now. I think through social media and Instagram, TikTok, we hear this term and like, what is it? What I would say is emotional abuse is when somebody uses psychological tactics to distort your reality, to gain control over you, to confuse you, to harm you.
Yeah.
And it's intentional. I think any of us can be have had times in our lives where we've said something or done something that had unintended consequences.
Yeah.
We said something to someone and we thought we were being helpful, but we hurt them. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about somebody who goes intentionally tries to manipulate reality
Yeah.
and cause harm to another.
Yeah. Deliberate.
Deliberate.
Deliberate. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Okay. Thank you. And why do you think people tend to dismiss emotional abuse as opposed to, say, physical abuse?
Yeah. Well, I think that the main thing I hear from the clients I work with is, well, they didn't really hit me. They just pretended they were going to. They got really
Yeah.
angry, but nothing ever happened.
Right.
So I think that's one, that there's this lack of evidence, I guess, in
Hmm.
some way.
Yeah.
I also think that to some degree, people are very dismissive of what happens in their relationships. Oh, he's a really nice guy, but when he drinks too much, or it's just when he's stressed and his boss is wearing him down, that he comes home and yells at us. So people are very dismissive, and I find in
Yeah.
therapy I have to be very direct with people who are in emotionally abusive relationships to point these things out, and also draw really clear lines between healthy and unhealthy or toxic behavior, because people just really get confused, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and so along that line, what are the dangers of people not taking emotional abuse seriously? Like what are the detrimental effects?
Yeah, so when somebody stays in a relationship that's emotionally abusive for a long period of time, we often see, of course, they come to therapy because they're experiencing usually depression, anxiety, or some form of trauma, like trauma response. So that might look like being hypervigilant, being jittery. Another big one is that people will have a hard time trusting others, even in healthy relationships, or they self isolate, so they stay away from all people because suddenly all people are scary and dangerous. So there's a lot of long term effects on people
Yeah.
psychologically. It takes a long time to reset after being in an abusive relationship. And so in that time, you may be less productive at work if you can work at all. Your other healthy relationships may fall to the wayside. Your children may develop anxiety disorders if you're anxious. I mean, there's a lot of trickle down effect for
Yeah.
people if they stay and tolerate something that's really quite intolerable for a long period of time.
Yeah. And also on that note, because one thing that I've certainly been learning through this podcast is there are people who want to leave and maybe they're taking the steps to do so, but they haven't been able to do so yet. There's one person who I just interviewed, the episode just dropped, and she, of course, under a pseudonym, she was very transparent. She's in therapy. She totally believes that she will extract herself from the relationship, but she said right off the bat, it's a current relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, there's these people are very, very scared. They're very
sure.
confused
Yeah,
about their self worth, about their own personhood, about their own value as a human being.
yeah,
They're often economically dependent on the person who's abusing them. They often don't have support from family, which is something I hear frequently. Oh, again, parents may be dismissive. Oh, all relationships are hard, or stick it through to the end. We've been married 50 years. We're not
yeah,
perfect.
yeah,
So there's a lot of reasons why people stay. I think the main thing is, like, for the person you just interviewed, they're coming, somehow they've had a realization that this is not what they want, nor is it what they deserve.
yeah,
And that, in fact, even if they can't see what the future looks like, there is another future, a different possibility for them. And so there's a spark of hope that that person perhaps has today that they didn't have maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about red flags. How can someone tell if they're being emotionally abused? Like any specific signs that they should look for? And you and I have talked before about what's emotional abuse versus just typical conflict in a
Yeah.
relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. So red flags for me would be, um, let's see, where do we start? There's a lot of them, but so one would be like generally checking in with yourself. How do I feel in the presence of this person? How do I feel when I'm not in the presence of this person? How do I feel when that person I know is coming home in an hour or 10 minutes? How do I feel when I see their phone number pop up? I
Yeah.
mean, those are just self check ins you can do. Again, if you're having a normal, healthy conflict with your spouse over the budget, and you know that tonight you're going to be talking about it, it's understandable that you're not excited for that conversation later. You might have some difference of opinions, but if you're talking about like a fear that you feel in your belly, or tightening of your muscles, or an absolute sense of dread when you
Yeah.
hear the car door slam or the garage door go up, or on the flip side, absolute relief when they're out of town on a business meeting for 3 days, or their mother's in town so they won't be drinking, or something like that. These
Yeah.
are like red flags that you can do internally for a check-in. Sort of more external things is like I would refer to the power and control wheel. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that, but on the
Yeah.
hotline, the domestic violence hotline website, you can get a copy of the power and control wheel. So they talk about the ways that abuse shows up. That's not, obviously there's physical, but there's sexual abuse. And that can happen in relationships. You can be raped in a marriage. You can be prostituted in a marriage. You can be forced into performing acts of sex that don't align with your values. So that's another way. Economic abuse. It could be that you have all your paycheck goes into a joint account, or into a bank account that you don't have access to,
Mm.
or that your partner has an account that they give you an allowance from, but the allowance that they give you is not enough to cover the basic necessities for you and your family.
Yeah.
So in the power and control wheel, we sort of go through these different things. Again, another one being your spouse or partner threatens and intimidates you. They yell at you, they humiliate you, they call you names, they put you down, they raise their fist, but they never hit you. They back you into a corner, but they weren't going to touch you. So these are the sort of like really overt red flags. The other thing is look at your kids. How are they around your spouse? How are they when they see daddy come home? And I talk about this about men because it most often happens to men, but by men are usually the perpetrators, but not by,
Yes.
certainly not always. Women
Yes.
are also capable of horrible things. And so, but look at your children. How are they around your partner? What is their vibe?
Yeah. And thank you for bringing up the power of control wheel, because certainly I'm familiar with it after talking with you. But I don't think any of my guests so far have mentioned it. And also, I am not a mental health professional, so it's really not my place to emphasize that. But yeah, you've recommended it. I'll try to provide a link to it in the show notes so they
Yeah,
can go check it out.
the power and control wheel, that it's on the hotline.org, and that's a great
Okay.
website for anybody who's experiencing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or just wants to find out more about like all these other areas where power and control can come into a relationship,
Yeah.
really like in such subtle ways. The other thing I just want to say about a red flag, and maybe
Yeah.
this is even like a precursor, is like look at your partner, your boyfriend, your girlfriend. Look at their relationships with their parents, and look at how their family treats each other. Look how they are with their other friends. Look around at their other relationships, because your marriage will in many ways be similar to
Yeah.
how they treat other people. Now, having said that, I know lots of couples who have come from harsh and difficult backgrounds, who have overcome things, have made challenges, but it's still information. Like, how
Yes.
was this person taught? What was their home environment like as a kid? What were emotions allowed? Were they overly allowed? Were they stifled? Did people treat each other with respect? I mean, these are just clues about who
Abs-
you're involving yourself with.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are things that I know that my husband and I are very open with each other about, because it's so important to have that transparency. And I know that we both work to do things differently in some ways than how we were raised.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really important. So I would actually, no, before we get to that, so once you've spotted the signs of emotional abuse, what do you recommend people do as far as next steps to help themselves?
Yeah, so I think when you start to feel that way, that you're having your own aha moments,
Yeah.
check in with some friends, check in with some families, a handful of people that you really, really trust. Get some feedback from people that know you, and certainly, I'm a psychotherapist, so I always recommend therapy, and I think it's a
I
great
do too.
place. And
Yeah.
there's 2 reasons for that, right? So I'm
Yeah.
saying talk to people who know you and know your relationship. Also talk to people who don't know you and your relationship. See
Mm.
how those 2 things jive because they're gonna have different perspectives. If you and I are friends, I'm gonna have seen you at barbecues or maybe we've gone to parties together or I knew you since you were a kid. I maybe have insight that your therapist doesn't have. That's good and bad. As a therapist, if someone comes and tells me all these things about their spouse that they're doing, that they're isolated from their friends, they don't have access to money, and that are constantly humiliated, and they're afraid to, when he comes home, I don't care how funny he is at a birthday party or how lavish his vacations are that he takes you on. There's red flags there that personal history doesn't really matter to me
Yeah.
as your therapist, and so that's why I think it's nice to talk to those 2 sorts of groups of people, knowing also that your friends, depending on your friends and your friend groups, they'll have a vested interest in you guys staying together. If you guys always party together on a Saturday night, or if you have a
Mm.
plan coming up, or if they've known him since year dot. So friends aren't always great sources in that regard, but they certainly are a starting place. So that's one thing. So talk to people, gain
Okay.
perspective. Second
Yeah.
of all, read blogs, listen to podcasts like this, find out what else is going on and how other people are in their relationships so that you can kind of gauge out like what is normal, what's healthy, what's unhealthy. And then, of course, address it with your spouse. And I really urge people to know their relationship and their person. If they if they can have a conversation with their spouse in a calm and direct way, it's very important. If they don't use accusatory language, like,
Mm.
I don't like it when you do this, you make me so angry. That's accusatory language. You
Yeah.
can say, using I statements, I feel intimidated when I hear the door slam and you kick the dog on the way in. That's just
Hmm.
how you feel. And it's also sticking to facts. So when you're talking to somebody who's emotionally abusive, I try to help people avoid emotional language like, "Oh, I was really scared to call you today because I thought maybe you might be upset and I wasn't really sure how your day was going." Too much information, right? Like it's too
Yeah.
emotional for them. Those kind of people really need to be to the facts. I need to have a conversation with you tonight when you get home after dinner when the kids are asleep.
Yeah.
There's no emotion in that. It's just the facts. So keep it short, keep it simple, start the conversation off. And then, of course, I would recommend some kind of counseling if you're going to move forward, because no matter how much somebody wants to move through a challenge on their own, it's really hard to do it without professional help. I mean, podcasts, Instagram reels, books, these are all great resources. And certainly the world is full of information. But there's something about having the accountability of a weekly session with somebody who's been trained to
Yes.
to to demystify so much and also to provide a safe space for exploration.
Absolutely. That's why I always say on every podcast that I am not a professional and that I highly recommend seeking professional therapy.
Well,
Yeah.
I just want to say too that having a podcast like yours and some of the other ones that are out there
Yes.
along these topics are so helpful because it's people may listen to a story that you present and they go, "Oh my gosh, I would never live in a relationship like that." But then if they actually do some exploration, there's some red flags that remind
Yeah.
them, or they hear a story and they're horrified and they realize it's just like their marriage, but they've never looked at it that way. So, yeah.
This podcast is still very new, but I did have someone who reached out to me, and she was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. And I just was so happy that I had created this podcast because she was finally realizing she needed to talk about, she has not done any therapy. So throughout that episode, I'm like, I highly recommend that be your next step, because this can't be it for you. So
Mhm.
yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. So, I know that, we have spoken before and over Instagram. I would love it if you could talk to me about what you've been seeing, and that how emotional and narcissistic abuse has been bubbling up more and more in your professional work. So I'd love to hear more about what you've been seeing in your professional practice and how you've been tailoring your work to helping people through this very specific kind of abuse.
Yeah, so I think for what I noticed the most, and I've heard this from other clinicians as well as divorce lawyers, the pandemic really brought some things home for people.
Mm,
So prior to, there's before the pandemic and after the pandemic, I think in most of our minds, the world operated one way, and then everything went to a standstill. And
yeah,
people, of course, for a long period of time, were at home with the people that lived in their household.
yeah,
I think this is where some things became very apparent for couples that maybe had used buffers of, well, he travels 3 days a week, or he goes out of town once a week, every 3 weeks, or he works 12 hours a day. So we don't see each other. So there were a lot of things that were bubbling under the surface in relationships, but there was enough space and distance between husband and wife that it never fully impacted them, I think, to a certain degree.
yeah,
Then suddenly the world shuts down. You're in behind closed doors, depending on your location and what sort of house you live in and your economic resources. I mean, stress levels are high. Even the healthiest, happiest people are feeling depressed. Couples that normally don't fight are fighting.
sure.
I mean, every
Yeah,
stressor out there is known to man. And for couples that were in a rocky relationship, it really became front and center and potentially dangerous, which was my
mm,
fear. For children in my community, if there's danger in the household and these kids don't have the access to school,
yeah,
so of course, wives and husbands too are in abusive relationships. So I think that to answer your question, that the change I saw was the pandemic brought some things front and center, and also for healthy couples who just suddenly realized, like, I really need to go to couples counseling. Like, we continue to have the same disagreement and we need help.
yeah,
So a lot of things were brought forward. And then secondly, we're kind of in this post, I don't know, pandemic phase where
yeah,
stores are open, people are going back into the office, people are traveling. And so on the one hand, some people have like skirted by and they're like, oh, thank God, my spouse is still out of the house 12 hours a day. So we're okay for now. Or, oh my gosh, I can now go to therapy and actually get my ducks in a row. I can make a change here.
mm,
So I'm seeing a lot of people, I think, kind of tackling what they had been ignoring. So I definitely see that. And then I think, honestly, just social media. I mean, you only have to flip through TikTok and
yeah,
Instagram and all the things. And there's all kinds of influencers and memes and conversation pieces around this. I think you also, see TV shows. I'm a fan of Ted Lasso. I just watched one most recent episode, and he talks about how he can't wait to talk to his therapist about his mother's visit. And
yeah,
I remember thinking, like, this is really cool. Like, this is a cisgendered white male talking about going to therapy,
yeah,
addressing some family dynamics with his mom. So, that's really normalizes things
yeah.
and again makes it more accessible to a woman or man who's at home afraid to take that first step. You only have to turn on TV, and any TV show that involves teenagers talks about their therapist and their therapy and their depression and all that. So it's normalized, and I think that has made people call more often. I don't know if that
Yeah.
answered your question. I can't remember.
Oh, it did. Yeah, because there was a lot to that question. So that was definitely part of it. I just
Oh, how I
yeah, I mean,
tailored.
I'd love to hear
Yeah,
about how you've been tailoring
tailoring,
your
yeah.
work. I know that you run several groups
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. So the way that I've tailored my work is twofold. I've added support groups
Mhm.
into my clinical work. A, because I work by myself and just trying to meet the need of people. If I
Yeah.
can meet 5 or 10 people in 1 hour versus one person an hour, that helps break down barriers to treatment for people.
Yeah.
And I also find that in the support groups I'm running, uh, people find a lot of connection and that they didn't have before because they feel so alone. If you feel that all your friends have a perfect marriage, quote unquote perfect marriage, and you're the only one who has any troubles or concerns or is thinking about divorce or separation, it's very, very isolating. to people. So the support groups are really there to bring people with a similar lived experience together. So I've been running divorce contemplation groups for women I was just looking, I think I've been doing it for 2 years now. I think I've run a total of 6 groups over the last 2 years for women who are considering divorce. Emotional abuse almost always comes up,
Sure.
and not always as the main topic, just as a side note, but for some
Hmm.
people it's main. Of course, domestic violence comes up,
Yeah.
um, infidelity comes up, incompatibility. I mean, all kinds of things. But just
Sure.
tailoring the support groups, and soon I will be launching a support group for parents who are alienated from their children. And this is like totally different, but also very similar, because parent alienation can happen during divorce, where one parent targets the other and sort of sets the
Mm.
child against them. And
Hmm.
then that targeted parent gets separated from their child, maybe either through like the legal system or just a rupture in the relationship because mommy or daddy has said too many bad things about them or threatened to not love them if they love the other parent. So that's another way that it's coming up. And I'm tailoring what I'm doing to try it. That's thankfully a small percentage of people who get alienated from their children, but
Okay.
it does exist, and it's a really shameful, grief-stricken process if you get
Yeah.
removed
Yeah.
from your child's life. Yeah.
Yeah. So I also definitely want to touch on the narcissist aspect of emotional abuse. I specifically call this podcast Emotional Abuse is Real because I want to make sure that, it encompasses all the different versions. But I know that my personal emotional abuse story definitely happened with a narcissist. And I just find that it's so commonplace. And I just love to get more of a clinical understanding of why this tends to happen with people who are deemed narcissists.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, the narcissist, his air to his lungs is power and control.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they look for people that they can intimidate, that they can control or manipulate.
Yeah.
And of course, they hate it if you don't succumb. And you know this personally,
Sure
Serene.
do.
So you've been through that. So you have
Yeah.
that very awful firsthand account of standing up to a narcissist,
Yeah.
and not being the oxygen supply.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say that I just want to be careful with the term narcissism, because it's really like a complicated one. It's a diagnosable. It is it's in the DSM, the manual that we use to diagnose people. So there is something called narcissistic personality disorder.
Yes.
It, about the numbers are very low on how many people in the general population would be diagnosed with this, and somewhere between like zero point 0.5 to like maybe 5% of people might actually have a diagnosable condition,
Hmm.
according to the latest research. So most people we meet, even though they're jerks in lots of ways and horrible in lots of ways, they're usually not actually diagnosable narcissists. Now,
Okay.
as a caveat, people who are narcissistic do not come to therapy and do not get diagnosed. So this is based on what we know about the general population, but also those people don't generally come to therapy because
Right.
they don't have self-awareness. They're not looking to introspect. They're not looking to develop themselves. They're just looking for another supply. So
Yes.
I just want to put that out there. And
No,
so
I'm glad you did because it gets tossed around so much. And especially when we talk about emotional abuse. And the only reason why I refer to my
yeah,
abuser as a narcissist is because my therapist used that term to describe
yeah,
him.
and he probably was,
Yeah.
and probably would be diagnosed that way,
Right.
because there are people. So, how do you know if you're dealing with a narcissist, or what I like to say, someone who has narcissistic like characteristics?
Sure. Yeah.
That way it's just kind of a broader term.
Sure.
They're going to be defensive to criticism. They're going to lack empathy. They're going to have a grandiose view of self.
Yeah.
They're going to be self-absorbed and arrogant. They will do anything they want to get do anything that they need to do to get what they want.
Yeah.
They'll have no problem manipulating or lying, and they will not feel remorse for it. Um,
Yep.
they'll also change the goalposts on you all the time. You'll think that you understand how to interact with them, but they'll change, and you won't have any warning about what changed. You'll just know
Yeah.
that you've upset them and you don't know why. They'll be they'll have a sense of entitlement. They'll expect people to respect and not only respect them, but want to be around them and want to know more, whether they know you or don't know you, whether you're the doorman at the hotel or someone that you work with. They want some kind of like real respect and grandiose reception. And they need admiration from others. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a good feeling.
No.
It's not a good feeling to be around. They can be also very charming. They can be very good looking. They can be, kind of fit the bill in terms of certain glances,
Yeah.
um, because they have to get
Yeah.
their oxygen supply.
Yeah. Yeah. I get
Yeah.
that. Okay, cool. So what is one thing that you want the public to know and understand about emotional abuse?
Well, I think your podcast name says it all. Emotional abuse is real.
Yeah.
It's somewhat subjective. So your experience of what might be abusive to you is somewhat subjective compared to maybe what somebody else is experiencing based on your own life experience, your own upbringing. But there are some general social mores, I guess you would say, and values
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
that someone who is emotionally abusive disregards, and so I often say to people when they're trying to figure out for themselves, like, is my relationship abusive, am I being manipulated? I usually say, if your best friend came and told you the story, what would your reaction be? Oh my gosh, I'd be so upset for them. Oh
Right.
gosh, no, I would. Or if your daughter or son came home and said they were in a relationship and these things were happening to them,
Yeah.
oh, well, without a doubt, I would say no. Okay, well, they're happening to you, and why is that different? So emotional abuse is real. It's hard to define in
Yeah.
some ways and quantify. And so I also want to say that as a therapist, I tend to be very non-directive in therapy. I don't tell people what to do. I don't, order you around. But when
Sure.
I am with somebody who's in an abusive relationship, I
Yeah.
do have to take a directive approach with them
Mhm.
because they really lack the insight and perspective of what's okay in
Yeah.
what's okay, because they've been told that they are the problem. They've been
Mhm.
told that to fix a relationship they must change.
Yeah.
Their partner has not taken any accountability. In your case, and your boss took no accountability. You needed to change. If things were going to get better, it was all on you.
Yes.
So taking a directive approach as a therapist with those people that have ascertained are in an abusive relationship is a game changer for them,
Mhm. Mhm.
because they don't have it at the beginning of therapy the perspective to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's real.
It
Believe
is.
something they tell you.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I have to thank one of the people whose story I told early on in the podcast, a male survivor who, when I asked him why do we need to talk about emotional abuse, his answer was because it's real.
Yeah,
And when I was starting to think about this podcast, I was like, that is a perfect title. So I know I gave him a shout out,
yeah,
under his pseudonym.
yeah.
But yeah,
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 it's
it
a
is. And so just with that, like, believe people too when they tell you the story, I mean,
yeah.
obviously fact check and use your own intuition when you're hearing things, but
Yeah.
if someone's coming to you and it's someone you trust and someone you love and they're telling you something is happening behind closed doors that other people don't know about,
Yeah.
try to provide a safe space, try to be open-minded to hear that, even if it really challenges what you think you know or believe about that person.
Yeah. Um, so I know that you gave the website for the for
Hotline.
hotline.org.
Yeah,
Yeah. Do you have any other websites that you recommend? I always end the podcast mentioning 988
yeah.
as well as the phone number and text line for the National Domestic Violence Hotline.
Perfect. Yeah, those two are perfect. I would just encourage your listeners to look around wherever they are located, whatever state and county they're located in. In the state of Maryland, we have something called the Mobile Crisis Unit that operates county by county, and almost not every county in Maryland, but almost every county in Maryland has a mobile crisis unit that operates from like 8 a.m. to like 2 a.m. or something. They'll come and meet you at your house if you're in a mental health crisis. So that's something we have in the state of Maryland, and you can find that very easily online. And other states, have statewide programs, but also each county and jurisdictions have their own things. You would be surprised when you start digging around in your local area what is
Okay.
out there. And you
Okay.
don't know it's there because you don't need it until you need it. So
Right.
also your county's health department, your local hospitals will have resources, or any of your local mental health outpatient clinics, which most counties will have an outpatient clinic that takes Medicare, Medicaid. Those sort of clinics have all the resourcing, the brochures. Your library, your local library and librarian can help you. So
Okay.
a lot of it is dependent on where you live, but there are resources in almost everywhere. Almost everywhere.
Wonderful. And thank you for bringing up the local
Yeah.
aspects. And just finally, if you want to share your, how people can find you, social media, website, and I'll link everything in the show notes, but
Sure.
whatever you want to share. Yeah.
Sure. I'm most active on Instagram, so it's Maryland Therapy Carrie, or my life coaching is Curiosity Life Coaching, and then my website is marylandtherapycarrie.com. And so those are all great ways to contact me for mental health. I'm only licensed in the state of Maryland and
Okay.
South Carolina. For life coaching, it has a totally different clientele and different set of rules, but that can be done nationwide, or really across the world, which is pretty cool. But it's different. If you're coming to me because you're being emotionally abused and you're having a trauma response, you need mental health, not life coaching.
Right.
So that's my job to ascertain what you best fit for.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but
Cool.
thank you for having me.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. And have a lovely summer.
Thank
And
you.
thank you again for everything.
Okay, take care.
Okay. Thank you once again for listening to my conversation with Carrie Mead on Emotional Abuse is Real. And thank you, Carrie, for appearing on the podcast. If you would like to learn more about Carrie's work as a therapist and as a life coach, I've included her websites and social media information in the show notes. And if you would like to share your emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out at hello@sereneleads.com or through Instagram at sereneleadsrights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988 or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. And I will also include the website for the National Domestic Violence Hotline in the show notes. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you can, please support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.